Hello, and welcome to our introduction to our personality study, which is Alexandra Kollontai. We're going to start by learning more about her personal background. Just let me show you what the syllabus looks like. So this here on the right is the syllabus page for our personality study. All of the personalities are set out with the same structure. So to begin with, you're looking at the historical context of the personality. Now, we already know most of this because of the studies we've done so far, and we will come and look at the role of women in Bolshevik/communist Russia in more detail as part of our study. What we're going to focus on to begin with is this background, the family background and education of our personality, and for Kollontai, her political activity up to 1917. And we will look later at what she does from 1917 onwards. Now, there's no detailed notes for this particular video. The reason for that is I don't want you to get too bogged down in the detail about her background. It's fascinating, it's interesting. We have to be able to pick out some key things from it to help us understand how she became the person that she became. But this slideshow will give you an overview of the details, and certainly you can supplement that with the readings that you're doing in more detail. So Alexandra was born in St. Petersburg in March 1872. We've got to have, and it's really important to understand that she was from a very wealthy aristocratic background. And so her upbringing is quite privileged and very educated. Her father was General Demontovich. So he was a general, and her mother was actually from a wealthy family with Finnish connections. They had been merchants. The Finnish connection becomes important later on. Now, this seems fairly standard, but in fact, it was a bit of a scandal when Alexandra was born because her father and her mother had actually had an affair. Her mother had been married to somebody else. And Kollontai was actually born out of wedlock through this affair, which was very scandalous for the time. And it's important to understand that from the very beginning, she is exposed to families that are doing things a little bit differently, despite their wealthy aristocratic background. Kollontai's parents very much loved each other and did become married, but her birth itself was a scandal out of this love affair. Her parents were also liberal reformists. So what that means is that they were aristocratic, upper class, but they were looking for change. So they're amongst that group of upper class people who are looking for perhaps a parliamentary democracy, certainly some limitations on the powers of the Tsar. And therefore they had a library at home stacked full of literature that exposed Kollontai to very liberal ideas from a very young age. Her parents encouraged Kollontai to actually receive a very broad education, which is not unusual for upper class women of her time. So languages were very common, French, English, German, of course, as well as the Russian. But one thing was a little bit different. Kollontai loved her academic studies more than most young women of her time, and she went on because she pushed her parents to make sure she had it, and she developed very sophisticated writing and debating skills as well as a part of her education. Now, as a young, wealthy lady, she went on holidays to Europe and spent summers in Finland, which was where her mother's family was from. This is important later on. She does have a connection with Finland, which we will, explore a little bit more later on. Kollontai very much has a love of learning and writing. And as she becomes older, her parents don't want her to go to school as such, as she might be exposed to, uninvited kind of ideas and people. So they do get her a tutor. Now, the tutor's name is Maria Stakova. Now, Stakova is not a revolutionary herself, but she certainly does have reformist ideas, and she instills in Kollontai from a very young age a sympathy for the working class and what they are doing, and a desire for reform that would improve the lives of everybody in Russia. Now, Kollontai was a very independently minded young woman, and she wanted to ensure that she would have some way of providing for herself in the future. This is very uncommon for an aristocratic young lady who should by that age have just been thinking about marriage, of course. But she pushed her parents to allow her to obtain her teaching certificate, and a teaching certificate gave her an option to work in the future, perhaps as a tutor herself if needed to be. She continued her education. She basically badgered her parents enough that they got in additional tutors, including professors from universities. So while she wasn't allowed to go off to university herself, she was certainly exposed to a high level of education and had people around her that developed her writing, her speaking. And certainly she was exposed to very high level literature. The first time that she reads Karl Marx and learns a little bit about socialism is while she's on holiday in Europe. The literature, of course, had been banned in Russia. But these upper-class Russian families, of course, had exposure when they were in Geneva or Paris, for example. A little bit of a tragedy. Her first real love that she fell in love with, unfortunately, he committed suicide while they were together. This was, of course, very tragic, but Kollontai did recover. In the end, however, she married against her parents' wishes, and she married her second cousin, Vladimir Ludvigovich Kollontai, which is where she gets her name from. And she married in 1873. She thought it was a love match. Her parents thought that she could do better. Vladimir was an engineer, effectively. Not a bad man in any way, but perhaps limited. He wasn't particularly reformist-minded. Didn't seem to have impressive outlook on life. But Alexandra Kollontai, did the right thing when she was married. She did, of course, the year after she was married, have a son called Misha. You can see a picture there of Kollontai with her husband, Mr. Kollontai, and their son Misha when he was a few years old. Unfortunately for Kollontai, however, she was not very happy in this married life. She was used to being able to read and write and think, and certainly Vladimir, Mr. Kollontai, did not stop her from doing that. He understood that she needed to develop these ideas, but Kollontai said that within the marriage she herself felt constrained. There was a lot of pressure on her to conform to a traditional marriage, and therefore she was unable to devote the time to really develop her thoughts. As a way to escape from the boredom of her traditional role in marriage, which she was trying to fulfill but really didn't feel comfortable about, she got involved in charity work. In particular, so her former tutor Maria Stakova had helped here. She would, take food, for example, to working class women and make sure that they and their children were being fed properly. It's probably about this time too that she starts expanding her reading, and in 1895 she read some very influential socialist texts, one by Babel about women and socialism, and another about Chernyshevsky, by Chernyshevsky, about communal living, how people can survive and progress better in a community where people have more equality and help each other. It's also around this time that she is exposed to a particular event that really refocuses her mind on what it is that she wants to do. And that is she visits alongside her husband, who is doing some building work. She visits a factory, and as she is getting a tour of the factory, she actually sees the appalling conditions in which the women are working in the factories, often with their children by their side. And in one particular instance, she sees this young boy, only, 3, 4 years old, who is effectively dying in his mother's arms. In fact, I think he had just recently died. And this really tugged on Alexandra's Kollontai's on her heartstrings because she had a son about the same age. And so this really kickstarts her career in terms of focusing on improving conditions for working women in particular. And it's here that we start to see the development of some of her ideas that in order for women to really escape these appalling conditions, they need to become more political and agitate on behalf of themselves. So women need to become political in order to assist all working women to improve their conditions. In 1898, Kollontai decides that marriage is really not working for her, and she leaves her husband and her son behind in Russia, and she goes to university in Zurich in Switzerland. And there she is really exposed to some, the heady days of socialism. A lot of debate and discussion is going on. And she is exposed to all of that and really embeds herself in this kind of academic discussion and debate. In 1899, she returns to Russia, and that's when she joins for the first time the Socialist Party. And she takes on a role doing a lot of writing for the party, starting to expand some of her ideas and express some of the ideas of others. Now, we know that there's the split in the party in 1903, and she is, she has leanings towards both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and she actually continues to do work for both of them. But eventually, from 1904, she kind of calls herself a Bolshevik. Here's another picture of Kollontai as a young woman. And we can see here, by this stage, she's in her 20s. She is a married woman. She has a child who she continues to have a relationship with, even when he's not living with her. And that relationship between mother and son is very strong for the whole of their lives. This is where Kollontai really starts to get more involved in the political work of the Socialist Party. And in 1905, she is in St. Petersburg when Bloody Sunday happens. You might remember that from our earlier studies. This is where the group of peasants and workers effectively are led by the priest, Father Gapon, and they are going to the Tsar to, give him their petition to let him know what is happening, seeking his support in looking for reforms. And that's where the Tsar's soldiers open fire and kill a number of the working class people who have come seeking assistance from the Tsar. Kollontai was there. She saw Bloody Sunday. We actually have an eyewitness account written by her. And truly she becomes very much an anti-war activist as a part of this experience as well. We might just leave it there and come back in part 2 to finish off this background.